Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Today we continue our series of programmes on the state of Britain's railways. Are rising passenger numbers an indication that we're entering a new age of the train? Or will fixed railway technology be overtaken by smart and more flexible transport innovations just around the corner? But first, over to Alex with your tweets, your messages and your emails.
Well, we still have a lot of reaction coming in about our series on Catalonia. And Caroline Wilson says, a fascinating exploration of the political, cultural and economic aspects of Catalan independence with voices from both sides. Now, Will doesn't like the comparison between Scotland and Catalonia. He says, Catalonia is a region of Spain that voted to secede and was violently oppressed. Scotland is a nation of the United Kingdom that was peacefully given a referendum and voted to remain in the UK. So there are really no similarities at all. But I'm not so sure, Will. I think there might be one or two similarities. Now, our series on the railways is already provoking some reactions. Steve Webster says, interesting discussion about the state of the railways. Reopened branch lines have proven successful, often breathing new life into towns and settlements. And finally, Subs strikes at the heart of one of the big issues just now. He says, we drive Edinburgh to Cornwall on a regular basis. It would be easier to take a train, but £440 for 2 advance return tickets compared to £160 fuel cost is just madness. And you've driven at one of the key issues affecting the railways now, Subs.
Last week, we examined the case for railway nationalisation and found that opinion, even among Conservative leading voters, has swung decisively in favour of renewed public ownership. Today, we focus attention on one of the giant capital investments, HS2 or Fast Rail. Is HS2 the route to the future, or a prestige project causing huge disruption, devouring an estimated £65 billion of scarce resources, while the backbone of the network buckles under the pressure? Thus far, HS2 has carried large parliamentary majorities and broad agreement between management and unions. But will that consensus hold as the project starts to hit the buffers of spiralling costs and mounting delays? First, Alex gets the union view from Mick Whelan, General Secretary of ASLEF, the Train Drivers' Union.
Mick, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Good morning, thank you.
Can I ask first, this week's departure of Paul Griffiths, the Managing Director of HS2, is that a sign the project's in trouble?
I don't think so. We've seen several people come and go over the time in such a major project, and it will take such a long time to fruition. And we wish him all the best for the future, and we hope he comes in, drives it forward once more. But
it was announced with a delay in the plans, or a further delay in the plans.
Well, we've never had a major infrastructure project come in on time, and as we've seen with Crossrail this week, again, it's going to be a further 9 months delay with that. I think there's so much investment gone into this now, it'd be harder to halt it than to drive it forward.
But ASLEF, as the Train Drivers' Union, I mean, you've been strong supporters of HS2, but as the project's unveiled, as it's being rolled out, is there any creeping doubts you have that perhaps are not on the right track?
Well, we've advocated major investment from Scotland, Land's End to John O'Groats everywhere. We need electrification everywhere. But when HS2 was proposed, there were no other major projects being proposed. We'd like a HS2 that starts in Scotland, starts in the southeast, starts building at the same time and meets in the middle.
That's what Brunel used to do. He built from both ends and met in the middle. He was building the West Country Railway. That's what he did.
That's true. I mean, for us, we'd also like to see a high-speed network that connects with each other. It was really sad for us when HS2 decided that to save money, they would take out the £700 million spur into HS1. I like the idea of people getting on to Birmingham or Manchester or elsewhere and going to Frankfurt or Amsterdam.
From a trade union perspective, is the fundamental argument for Fast Rail?
There is a fundamental argument. People are demanding it. And there is the real issue. Also, we've got so many green targets to hit in the next 20 or 30 years. It's a requirement. 55% of most emissions come from transport, 17% of those come from road transport, only 2% comes from rail. And if we can, by creating paths through HS2, get more freight onto rail, we're driving that forward.
But HS2, I mean, it's a £60 billion project now. Some people say it'll be £100 billion before it gets to Manchester. Wouldn't it have been a way to invest these sums in increasing capacity and perhaps in a more comfortable journey for the passengers?
Well, unfortunately, no. As you said, Mr. Brunel and others were too good. The Victorian engineers created so many viaducts, cuttings, tunnels and whatever else. The ability to double-decker trains without redigging up the whole railway, disturbing whole communities and knocking millions of houses down doesn't exist.
I mean, a lot of resentment. We did some filming around Euston Station and people say, look, we were promised replacement facilities, there's no sign of them, we're losing our street, we're losing our communities. Do you think the social impact of HS2 has been properly handled?
I don't. I think, and I go around the country and I see an awful lot of people complaining about HS2. There's, in certain areas, a bit of NIMBYism. And it does seem a contrast to me that we can build tunnels through the Chilterns to offset some complaints, and then where there's social housing, we just level it. That can't be right.
You think there's more political clout in the Chilterns than there is in Camden?
I think there quite possibly was, particularly when the Prime Minister came from that area.
Now, I'm appointing you Secretary of State for Transport. And who knows, there might be a vacancy very soon. What would be the decisive move you would make coming into office to get a real plan for the railways?
Well, first, I hope Annie MacDonald is the next Secretary of State for Transport, naturally. But I think that where we're going to go...
She's the Labour shadow spokesperson.
Is a Labour shadow spokesperson. But our reality was, you know, everybody, don't matter what the demographic is now believes the railways need to be renationalised. And if we're actually going to have joined-up thinking, we're going to have integrated transport where buses meet trains, where we have a freight sector, where we grow for the growing population. But our biggest problem is we haven't got the capacity for the growing population.
If the railways are going to take, if fast rail is going to take a long time to be completed, and they haven't followed your advice on building from both ends, isn't there a risk that by the time all that capital investment is committed, that there'll be other different types of fast and smart transport? You get into the 2030s and 2040s, isn't the new generation of transport systems going to be quite different from fixed point railways?
Well, people talk about Hyperloop, they talk about maglev, but that takes investment, that takes time. And the reality in this post-bankers crisis world, there isn't that investment, there isn't that willingness. There's never been a 10, 20, 30-year vision for our railways. We go from Parliament to Parliament. We welcome Crossrail, but Crossrail's delayed. Crossrail was first mooted in 1949. The Channel Tunnel was first mooted in Napoleonic times. I wish, as you would know from previous experience, that our major projects would happen sooner and the wherewithal was there to do it when we need to do it.
I think the first Channel Tunnel, they stopped it because they were worried about a French invasion. Was that not the idea?
They did, and they also discovered coal in Kent, I believe. But,
So we're in the situation where there's this major investment project at HS2, the biggest capital project, single capital project outside some nuclear power stations that the government has ambitions on. Is there not a risk that that's going to siphon off much-needed investment elsewhere in the railways?
Well, the real problem is that outside of London, we haven't seen major investment. There's been some major projects in Scotland, which you'd be well versed with. About in the northwest and northeast, they've been getting hand-me-downs of second-hand trains. You get new trains in London. We then cast the older trains elsewhere. The average age of rolling stock in some areas is 42 years old. We still have semaphore signals in certain areas of the country.
Semaphore. Explain that to the viewer. What's a semaphore signal?
Well, back in the old days of the Victorians, you used to put paraffin in a little lamp and you used to have a little signal that went up or down, a bit like on Thomas the Tank Engine. We still have semaphore signals. We still have 2 colour lights, 3 traffic lights, 4 traffic lights. We talk about a digital railway we hope to have.
Isn't that the sort of investment that would actually work in terms of speeding up journeys and not having delays, not being stuck waiting for the express train and still single track lines? Isn't that the sort of investment that would actually make a big difference to the passengers?
It would, but has anybody proposed that? Has anybody actually started a process or a project that we could now say that we're 5 years into that's going to deliver some of the capacity that we're going to need for the growing population in the next 10, 15 or 20 years? Well, no, they haven't. We have one project at the moment that's going to do some of that, will alleviate some of the problems, but we hope that project will then drive other projects. In the old days, people used to travel around the UK, generate for the local economies and generate for the gross national economy. We've actually got a railway now that deters people from travelling unless they book 3 months in advance. We've got to get away from that philosophy.
Can you mentioned Crossrail and the delays in the Crossrail project. Are you worried that HS2 is going to be beset by the same sort of delays?
I'm always an optimist. I live in hope that eventually someday somebody's going to deliver, whether it be a motorway or a railway, on time. But the fact that it's going ahead, the fact that it would now get to a point where it would be less cost effective to stop it, gives me hope it will be finished. And once it's finished, then what do we demand next? What do we need? And that's where we should be going.
Would your advice be to the current Secretary of State for Transport, for goodness sake, start from the north as well, so we can actually finish this project in some sort of reasonable time over the next 2 decades?
Well, it's more than that. How can you have 2 major cities in Scotland that have no high-speed network? If we were to do an analogy, if you look at when they built the railways between Madrid and Barcelona, prior to that, the only way to get from Madrid to Barcelona was either road or by flight. Now, only 1 in 10 journeys are by air.
And apart from the big capital projects was talked about, Crossrail, HS2, what other, and investment in the signal infrastructure, is there any other significant, under public ownership, of course, is there any other significant initiative you think would make the big difference and perhaps solidify this this growing alliance between the railway unions and the railway commuter?
Well, I think it's quite clear that we're now pricing people out of the railway. Because of the lack of social housing, particularly in major conurbations, people are having to travel further and further for work. Of course, the precarious nature of work isn't helping. So the core economics of the railway have always been based on season ticket sales. Well, season ticket sales this year dropped by 9%. That's because if you've got 0 hours contracts, you don't know if you're working next week or next month. If you've got faux self-employment, you're not sure if you're going to be working 3 months from now. So why would you buy a monthly, a quarterly or an annual season ticket? If we want to rebuild the faith in the railways, we've also got to do the other things in politics that make people content to know that they invest and they can travel and they have got jobs to go to.
And so you're saying get the fares down. This will be music to the ears of the commuters.
Well, it's a political choice to pass the pain from the of the fare box from the taxpayer to the commuter. And the reality is that every pound spent in transport generates £5 for the economy. So it's forced economy to do so.
Now, Mick, ASLEF famously was one of the few unions who came out in favour of Brexit. But as that has started to unwind, have you any concerns that there might be a spillover in the capital projects if there's a no-deal Brexit and money gets very tight?
Quite naturally, but also we have a major concern. The reason that we supported Brexit was that we've been in favour of nationalisation for over the last 20 years. Is still we don't want a Europe that will drive us to a position of permanent privatisation of the railways. But quite naturally, we do look at the various sectors within the railways. And of course, we do have the disadvantage in the UK that 85% of our train operators are either wholly owned or partially owned by state operators in Europe.
So the publicly owned European companies are private operators in the UK?
That's correct. And we've even had questions in the Dutch Parliament about Abellio, whether they should continue to invest in railways in the UK and buses. So there are a number of concerns on the horizon.
Well, Mick, I didn't manage to make you Secretary of State for Transport in this interview. However, you get the Alex Salmond Quake for appearing on the show. You know the drill. Whiskey, only Scotch in the Quake. Pass it round all your members. Obviously not when they're on duty.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex.
Great pleasure, Mick. Thank you so much. And now over to Taz, who has a statement from the Department of Transport, and she also has some public reaction to HS2.
Now, none of the Department of Transport ministers were available to be interviewed, but they gave us this statement to signal their support for HS2. As a future backbone of our national rail network, HS2 is vital for delivering better connections between our major cities, with faster and more frequent services, acting as a catalyst for jobs, housing and economic growth. Once the full network is completed, the railway will carry more than 300,000 people each day, directly connecting 8 of 10 of Britain's largest cities and their regions. At peak construction in 2020-21, over 30,000 jobs will be directly created, with around 100,000 jobs to be created from the regeneration around new high-speed stations. Meanwhile, outside Euston Station, there are some mixed feelings as to what HS2 means for the travelling public.
It is running through ancient woodland, and it's putting money into one line instead of spreading the money across the country to ensure that small communities can be viable and reduce car use and therefore promote a low carbon economy, which we need, a low carbon economy.
Well, I'm aware of it. I don't quite understand why it's such a wonderful thing, given that it doesn't seem to reduce journey times that much or dramatically, and it will be, it will certainly price ordinary travellers off its trains.
Well, it's not coming to Liverpool, which is very nice, I suppose, really. Can't go everywhere, but I think Liverpool's quite an important network around the northwest, and obviously has quite a lot of links with London.
I think the HS2 project is a great mistake. I think we're much better to put the money into improving the infrastructure in other parts of the country, such as the southwest.
Thus far, HS2 has had a broad coalition of support, but has also met with strong grassroots resistance. Coming up after the break, we speak to the people who regard fast rail as a step backwards, not as a leap forwards. See you in a minute.
Welcome back. As we all know, HS2 has had its fair share of critics, none more so than the residents of Camden Town, who feel their borough has been particularly hard hit. Having banded together to join Stop HS2, residents have shown real solidarity against fast rail. We're delighted to be joined by 3 of those such residents from Camden Town today. John Neve, Primavera Bowman and Dan Llewellyn-Hall, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. What brings you, of course, all together? You're all residents of the borough of Camden. Perhaps, John, you can tell us what that means for you all in terms of HS2.
Yes, well, as you say, we're all residents of Camden. We live in the area which is around Euston Station and just to the north of the station. And as you know, the new high-speed line is on its way into Euston from the north. So we're in the firing line, as it were. And where we live is about to become the biggest construction site in Europe. So to give you an idea of what we face, we've been told by HS2 that in order to develop the line, they're going to have to remove 3.5 million tonnes of spoil, and that will mean hundreds of thousands of HGVs, heavy goods vehicles, coming in to and out of Camden over a 15-year period, because the whole project's going to run through till 2033.
Dan Llewellyn-Hall, where is the development now? I mean, has it started? Is the preparation works happening? What's been the impact so far?
Well, and you can see from one flank of Euston Park in particular, where the work has visibly commenced, is that the park has been cleared up. It's boarding all around it. It's all made to look as though it's all very friendly and green, and in fact, what it's doing is quite contrary to that. It's creating havoc really in that environment on the busiest road, the most polluted road probably in Europe. And we have this great little green sanctuary outside the station, which is just slightly inconveniently in the way, and they're going to remove a 300-year-old park for the sake of that.
And of course, Dan, you're an artist. Most of us going to say recently, but 2013-14 it was the last portrait painted of Her Majesty the Queen. You, of course, have expressed your opposition through art and have painted various canvases in relation to the tree felling that will result, or has resulted, due to HS2. How's that been received?
Well, it's one other way, I think, of first of all bringing a group of people together who are somewhat fractured by this whole event, and it creates a certain amount of positivity, but also brings focus onto the park and creates a visibility for it, particularly when you're making drawings and paintings. So we've had numerous schools that took part in a couple of days that we had on the park itself, where this work is all starting, and an exhibition just across the road. So it's all very much a big community effort. We had Sir Keir Starmer even came and had a look, and we're hopeful he's going to make the right words to progress things in the right direction. But particularly for my interest in this group, which we're working with as an arts activity, is really to draw attention to this green little oasis that we would like saved. And we appreciate, we can see now that the HS2 is well and truly underway. It's happening up and down the country. We're not as stupid to think that the whole process is going to grind to a halt, but we'd like to see a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of tolerance in the way that HS2 deal with the community, and not have this proxy sort of consultation. And
Primavera, you're moving on from sort of the environmental to the environmental aspect. You're concerned about effect on ecosystem, plants, animal life, and indeed
they're going to deforest up and down the country and close ecosystems. They say they're going to build new ecosystems, but it takes 400 years, to build an ecosystem. So that's rubbish. They've already closed 1.5, Euston parks down. They're exhuming bodies of a graveyard. And the pollution, we are the fifth, one of the 5 polluted countries in the world. The pollution is going to go sky high. I'm really worried about the air pollution. And Klein Earth has taken the government to court 3 times, and the 4th time to the EU Parliament. I've gone to our house, which is part of the UN environmental division, and but they're not compliant. They don't mitigate.
John, Dan says you have to be realistic that the project is going to go ahead, and what your campaign is doing now is not so much trying to stop the project, but to mitigate its worst environmental effects. You know, is that the view of all the campaigners, or some people still hope that the government will mend its ways and realise that this project might well go off the rails?
I think we do want to raise awareness of what we're about to face in Camden. As I said earlier, we're about to become the biggest construction site in Europe, so the impacts are about to really hit us. The other thing is that, I mean, we do feel that in Camden, as in other urban areas, we're not being treated in the same way as residents in rural areas in terms of compensation. So, you know, there are people whose houses are going to be right up against the construction site. There's one house in particular I'm thinking of where the people living there are not going to be able to get into their front door. They're not going to be able to access their driveway, and yet they're not being compensated at all. So there seems to be a fundamental unfairness in the way that people in urban areas are being treated compared with those in the country.
However, sticking to the topic of compensation, there are people who've already been affected. Are they receiving the compensation that they were promised?
No, there was a Bengali couple. I went to a meeting with some lawyers, and you know, they'd been turfed out of their place at a minute's notice. And one, you know, they're in their 70s. They own their flat, and the husband is with the son on the couch, and the wife is on another couch of the daughter's house way out of London. I mean, and they haven't seen a penny. And, you know, another one, the Brie Louise, I think it's now 8 months or something like that, and they haven't seen a penny either.
That's a pub, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, it's a pub, and very, I mean, everyone used to go there. They had, you know, it was a great place, and they haven't seen a penny, and they've been ousted out. Meanwhile, the pub is, you know, it's still standing. They haven't done anything there. They could have been living there instead of spending all their savings. I mean, it's really preposterous, actually, what the government's doing.
And, you know, we're talking about the decimation of our heritage. We're talking about, as Prim says, about this exhuming of thousands of bodies from this St James's graveyard, which they still haven't got plans to relocate, by the way. And amongst of these people, there's people the likes of Sir John Soane and all these esteemed people, which I think they sort of don't really look at these things in the finer details. The plans aren't put in place, and the consultation is bogus.
But Dan, isn't the counter-argument, as a country, a project like Fast Rail, the biggest infrastructure project in the history of transport in the UK, something like that is the project of the future, and it would be impossible to build a project like that without some alteration of the physical environment somewhere. Absolutely, and I don't think for one moment that we have to, you know, prioritise anything to do with heritage above great infrastructure projects, and particularly things to do with employment. But I'm not entirely convinced that's the case, because as John was saying, they could very, very easily move this departure point for the station. In a way, I think if you look at the scheme further down the line, there are other ways in which they're going to make more money to fund something further up. So it's a quite a devious thing in some respects. And this bigger argument to say about employment and this huge travel massive hub which they're creating isn't actually essential when you think about it. We've already got the connections into London. We don't need this thing ramroding its way right into... Are you saying that they should have started Fast Rail in Scotland, in the north of England, where the project would have much more support?
I do think so. The connectivity into London is perfectly good. In fact, we need to get congestion out of London. We don't want to increase congestion, that's for sure. The areas are too condensed. There's much greater opportunities as a nation to develop the north more like that and have a better connection into the Midlands. And this is something that HS2, I think, has not even for one moment thought about. And why this idea of obsession with access to the south and development of the south, totally unnecessary. We don't need development in the south. It's overdeveloped. It's overdeveloped.
Exactly.
And these precious little bits of our ecology, for example, in the urban environments, is what I'm particularly interested in. And this land grabbing is really unacceptable. And for the greater good of our nation, is environmentally disastrous.
Is there anything that the government could do for the good people of Camden to persuade them to get behind HS2? What if there was one thing that you would like, or a few things maybe, that they could change or consider to make it more palatable, acceptable, workable for you? What would that be? Well,
anything they can do to reduce the impact on people would obviously be incredibly welcome. I talked about compensation, but that's not the only thing we're looking for, I think. I mean, one big improvement would be if they could get more into more of the materials coming in by rail and more of the spoil, the waste going out by rail rather than by road. After all, this is a railway project. It is coming into Euston. You'd think this would be the ideal place to make maximum use of the railways. So that's one of the things we're we're pushing for and will continue to push for.
Primavera, if you could make one last appeal to those who are running HS2 and to the government and parliamentarians, what would that appeal be,
Well,
given your personal experience?
Apart from saving the debt and scrapping the whole stupid scheme, I don't know. I think Old Oak Common is a better solution. Double deck down for the Euston Station would be less land grabbing than what they're suggesting.
But would you like these decision makers, beyond the sort of organised and staged meetings, would you like them to come down to Camden and actually physically look at what's really going on the ground?
I think they have once or twice, but it's to deaf ears. They don't. They have this thing in their head, and there's no compliance. There's no listening. They tick the boxes, so that they can say to the R House, "Oh, we've done it all." But they don't communicate, and they do something, and then they ask the question rather than asking us, and then compliance, changing their design a little bit.
So, Primavera, if you had to make one final appeal to the bosses of HS2, what would that appeal be, given the experience of people in Camden?
Start the train in Scotland and bring it down. Because they need trains, they need east-west, they need, from one city in Scotland to the other. We don't need, I have 2 trains behind my house. Why are we triplicating it and running the debt from here to here? We're so much in debt, do we need this? I mean, it's only the investors that are going to make money.
We've had a lot of public meetings and we've come together on many occasions, and there is a very strong feeling across the borough about this issue.
And good luck to you all in your campaign.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Now, coming up in next week's show, we continue our exploration into the impact of HS2 on local communities and ask if it really will be that catalyst for jobs, housing and economic growth that the government promises. Last week's show discovered a developing consensus that the present twin-track system of public infrastructure and private operators was probably past its sell-off date and certainly not the way to run a railway. This week has illustrated a growing concern that too much of the railway's scarce resources are being invested in speed and prestige, while the emphasis should be on comfort and facilities for the travelling public. And an abiding thought that effective fast rail would also have started north to south rather than just from London upwards. The HS2 train is due to reach Manchester and Leeds in 2033 at a cost of a cool £60 billion. But by the time it pulls into these northern stations, will new forms of smart, flexible mass transportation already be signalling that this new age of the train was a passing phase, not a route to the future? And so from Tasmina and me and all at the Alex Salmond Show is goodbye for now.